We acknowledge that we record this show on the land of the Piramonk people and pay our respects to their elders past and present. G'day comrades, g'day Liz.
G'day.
I'd like to wish everyone a very happy, if your dog knocks out your microphone 20 minutes into a recording, that you notice it. I hope everyone managed to have a nice break, even those of you up where it was cold over this time of year, and I hope that no one else was bitten by a spider.
Oh dear me, that was a fun trip to the ER. They didn't like it that we rocked up with a live spider in a takeaway container.
Yeah, but I thought you were meant to bring the spider so they could identify it.
They understood. They were just a little bit freaked.
On to what we're here to talk about. So this episode is a part of the 101 series. So far in this series, we've introduced Nagel's insight that there seems to be something wrong with how we conceptualize consciousness pre-theoretically. And we've looked at a few responses to this in terms of how consciousness can be understood for the purposes of measurement and blocks distinction between different phenomena, which are labelled consciousness, in particular the access versus phenomenology distinction. This episode is the last of what I was thinking of as the theory light episodes, although it's certainly not theory neutral. Now, I have changed our run sheet a little bit, Liz. I did mention this to you in the previous recording as well, that as we're getting more into specific concrete proposals as to how to explain consciousness or describe it more, we are using more and more these concepts of mental representation and mental computation. So before we turn from this sort of early conceptual work to theories, I want to do a few episodes on what representations are, what mental representations are in particular, and some proposals as to what mental computation might be. Today, I want to start talking about the global workspace model of consciousness, and in particular how consciousness is reimagined by the originator of that theory, Bernard Baars. The paper I've chosen is one that's not just a presentation of the theory or arguments for it. And it's interesting because while it definitely depends on the global workspace model, which we will talk about a little bit, the reconceptualization offered by Baars here is done by a series of metaphors rather than the theory. How much the metaphors apply, of course, depends on the theory one adopts. So this will give us a way into theorizing via the metaphors and reconceptualizations that Baars suggests. Baars suggests that we study consciousness using a comparative approach. So asking what's the difference between a stimulus subjects report seeing and one they don't, but which still affects their behavior. What does that remind us of?
It's a bit like Dennett studying the difference between conscious and unconscious.
We're asking subjects to say what they see, for example, or hear, and then looking at the difference between when they're telling us they see or hear or whatever modality we're studying something and when they don't. So this is very much like heterophenomenology. But it's also important here that Baars invites us to imagine the examples he uses from the first person perspective. He attempts to induce in the reader some of the comparison states that he's talking about by asking us to imagine them, remember similar scenarios, and so on.
So he's studying the experiences of others to make an argument about the nature of consciousness, and he's getting us to triangulate that with our first person perspective.
So it is legitimate to ask, and we don't get a clear answer to this question, I don't think, in this paper. How exhaustive does Baars think a purely third-person approach to consciousness is? Indeed, he says, this is a quote, The meaning of consciousness intended here is best illustrated by your own experience. Verifiable public report is the key scientific evidence, but your experience here and now is quite a good index to it. All of the subjective demonstrations used here can be tested objectively, and all the objective facts can be experienced by you and me." End quote. The key move for Baars in his argument is the contrastive one, so asking what's the difference between what the subject can report and what they can't.
So what the subject can report is how to measure consciousness. Okay, yeah, might mean that you capture things that are conscious. It might mean that you don't capture everything. If you can report it, you're probably aware of it. If you can't report it, babies can't report it.
And other sorts of animals that we have other reasons to suspect are conscious, and so on as well. This, of course, is one place where Baars' claims are somewhat theory dependent.
I'm happy to say that it's sufficient. I'm questioning its necessity.
Necessity, yeah.
But that's cool. Let's start by looking at things that everyone's pretty sure are conscious.
So a big difference for Baars between these states which we can report and those that we can't. So we're thinking here about the difference between reporting a word that's presented for a second on a screen and a masked priming word that's presented for a small fraction of a second and then covered with a mask, or if we're thinking about a binocular rivalry study, which we've talked about a few times, the difference between the image presented to one eye that you can report and the one that's presented to the other eye that you can't report. A big difference here for Baars is in processing capacity. Consciousness, so understood, looks rather narrow, limited, and slow compared to what can be processed unconsciously. So some of this is quite intuitive. Think of what it's like to try and listen to two people talk at once. I'm especially bad at this since the PTSD, but it's generally true that at most one stream of speech is comprehensible at a time. If we think of attempts to make multiple streams comprehensible at once, I'm thinking here of something like Carolyn M. Yocham's story, "We Will Teach You How to Read, We Will Teach You How to Read," which we'll pop a link to. The only way to do this seems to be to make one stream simple and repetitive. So that said, if multiple streams of speech are presented at once, the stream that isn't attended to and comprehended must be processed to some extent. So, Liz, how do we know that?
Because you can see that it influences your behaviour, even though you can't tell them about it.
Yeah, so things like the dichotic listening experiments where people wear headsets and one ear is presented one series of words and the other ear is presented another one, and they're told to listen to just the left side. How they interpret that side can be biased by what's presented to the right ear. We can also demonstrate this more simply with a more mundane experience, one that doesn't require an experimental setup. So I'm thinking here of the cocktail party effect.
Yep, so you're at a party, you're talking to somebody, paying lots of attention to them, and then suddenly from across the room you hear your name. Now, you have no conscious awareness of paying attention to that other conversation, and yet it's your name, so your attention's grabbed by it. So you must have been processing what was going on, because you respond to your name, but you weren't aware of anything they were saying. And it's a fun game to see what other words you have the cocktail party effect for.
So, in contrast to consciousness so understood, our unconscious minds are staggeringly large. So Baars is going to demonstrate this just by considering the English word set. Just this one word has a wide variety of meanings, so many that Baars claims that the complete OED uses 75,000 words to describe them all. Now, I didn't go and check that, but there are a lot of different meanings to the word set, and we generally don't have a problem in selecting among them. So consider this is a quote of how Baars demonstrates this. It can be a game in tennis or a collection of silverware. We can set a value on an antique or build a stage set. Glamorous people make a jet set, and unlucky ones are a set of fools. The sun sets, but is certainly not set in concrete. Mathematicians use set theory, and psychologists talk about set as readiness to act or experience something. End quote. There's a few things to note from this. First being that all of the meanings must somehow be stored in us for us to comprehend that paragraph. But just as important, I think, is that we really can't tell from introspection alone how we switch between the different meanings to comprehend the paragraph. So our unconscious minds here are not understood as just a store of information, but as a very large amount of processing that we just don't notice, or even in this case, things that we can't notice. Baars makes another claim here as well. Quote, understanding language or anything else that integrates separate bits of content demands the gateway of consciousness. This is another case of the general principle that consciousness creates widespread access to unconscious sources of knowledge, such as the mental lexicon, meaning, and grammar. End quote. He hasn't really argued for that yet, but we're starting to get a sense of his conceptualization here. Consciousness is narrow but allows things to be integrated, and unconsciousness is huge but disjointed.
What's fascinating about watching Liz play Minecraft is, as you can see, I'm really not a gamer. And so it takes a lot of processing power for me to just move my character around the world. And so much so that it needs to be integrated and made conscious in a way that perhaps it wouldn't need to be for other people. And it gives you a sense... See, I just failed to type T to TP because I can't do two things at once. No, not minus 64, Liz, you'll be underground. So you can see what consciousness does and doesn't, what that awareness does and doesn't enable.
We also have here a hypothesis as to the nature of consciousness. Consciousness creates access, is the claim here. When something like the meaning of a word enters consciousness, it becomes accessible by other parts of the mind, such as the mechanisms that produce speech. Whereas prior to this, it was just stored in a part of memory, the mental lexicon. We'll see in coming weeks, as we start to go through the theories a bit more, that this is subtly different from what I think are clearer views that understands consciousness as the access, that makes a sort of identity claim that consciousness is the access processes. But Baars here is conceptualizing it as causal. Consciousness is the thing that causes access. For those that have read ahead and are familiar with Dennett's objection to the Cartesian theatre, this is one of the places where I think it's ambiguous as to whether or not the theatre metaphor Baars is using is a version of the Cartesian theatre. But if you haven't read ahead to that, there's no need to worry. As well as beginning to see Baars' proposed conceptualization of consciousness here, we're getting a more general picture of the mind. Baars is assuming that the mind is composed of a bunch of highly specialized, relatively isolated systems, and that consciousness is what integrates across such systems. So Liz, the question is then, is this a reasonable assumption? And what sort of evidence would speak to it?
Well, I think it makes a lot of sense of, say, the visual system, because it's easy to underestimate how much processing is required to create the visual experiences we can talk about and reflect on. And the same for the other senses. And, what's interesting about watching me play Minecraft is that things that Glenn can do automatically, and in some sense less consciously or less aware of them, I need to really think explicitly about, such that I can't talk and do the stuff in Minecraft, because that unified stream of consciousness has a much more limited capacity.
So there's lots of things going on, like with the accessing the different meanings of words and so on, that must be done somewhere that aren't broadly accessed. That's point one. Point two would be the sorts of extremely narrow deficits people can acquire through injury or through developmental differences. So I'm thinking things here, stuff like acalculia, so the inability to do maths, prosopagnosia, which is inability to distinguish faces, inability to detect motion and so on. These are all things that can occur in isolation.
And this stuff can get incredibly interestingly fine-grained. So I paid my way through uni in part by tutoring maths, and one kid I tutored had a pure sequencing deficit. So he could not put things in sequence. So if you think back to primary, early primary school, when they show you circle, square, circle, and you have to put square, couldn't do that at much older than 6. Really great at other things, but he had this pure deficit just in ordering.
Yeah. But otherwise was okay at maths?
Yeah, so if it was like geometry that didn't require addition and things like that, it makes it clear how much maths is sequencing. But as soon as you got to something that didn't require sequencing, he was fine.
Yeah. So he's all right with geometry, so it's not just a general spatial deficit.
But geometry, well, and he was an amazing visual artist. So it wasn't a general spatial deficit because he could draw realistic images. A lot of geometry is like calculate the area, though, and that requires multiplication, which is based on sequencing. So when you found the things that didn't require sequencing, he was fine.
Yeah.
But finding the things that didn't require sequencing is interestingly tricky in a way.
Yeah, God, that would have made school so frustrating for that poor kid. Yeah.
He had lots of good support. But he was fine with language, which in some sense is sequencing, so,
Yeah, but we also think that language has its own highly specialized systems that sit independently of other more general cognitive abilities as well.
The point.
Because you have people who can be very good even at one aspect of language, like the verbal aspects of language, but still have dyslexia.
Yeah.
And really struggle to learn to read.
Which again makes the point that all of these things are quite dissociable.
All of those things all are the sorts of standard reasons why we'd give to support this idea that Baars is using, that the unconscious mind is composed of a bunch of highly specialized, relatively isolated systems. So the approach Baars is using here is to take some standard insights from psychology about the nature of the mind to suggest a conceptualization of consciousness, which he is then going to elucidate with the metaphor of a theatre. He is quite clear that he thinks the metaphor is helpful in some ways and misleading in others. So, like all metaphors, it's analogous to what we're talking about in some ways, but there are disanalogies as well. Again, I just want to note for those who are more familiar with the literature that he says the metaphor he's using isn't a Cartesian theatre. He says those words, which is a term Dennett introduced to try and highlight instances where theorists could do better at giving up all of the assumptions imported from a substance dualist conception of the mind. Descartes being the most prominent substance dualist. Substance dualism is the view that the mind exists as a separate kind of thing to the physical universe. His reason for saying this isn't a Cartesian theatre is that, unlike the view Dennett's criticising, he isn't proposing that there's a single place in the brain where everything comes together to be presented to consciousness. I don't want to talk about this too much, Liz, because we haven't talked about these arguments from Dennett yet in the 101.
Yeah.
But I think there are serious concerns about whether Baars has correctly identified the core features of the Cartesian theatre metaphor.
It doesn't have to be a spatial place.
Yeah, but just for our fellow nerds out there, this is the part where Baars says that his theatre is distinct from the Cartesian theatre, and that's the reason that he gives. So let's turn to Baars' theatre metaphor. In his metaphor, the theatre has four main parts. These are 1, the stage that is working memory; 2, the backstage that influences what can make it onto the stage; 3, the conscious spotlight that selects particular parts of the stage for presentation; 2, 4, the audience, which are other unconscious parts of the mind. Confusingly, in one of the diagrams, the sensory input and the motor output are presented as sort of bypassing the backstage and audience unconscious mechanisms.
What? So the sensory input isn't conscious?
Yeah, I think that's just a problem with the diagram, though I don't think it's something of significance, because in the text, what he's saying is that the sensory input's the backstage and the motor output's part of the audience in the metaphor. So I think that it was just a sort of poorly drawn diagram. What Baars emphasises here is the convergent input to the stage and the divergent output. So thinking of the stage of working memory as containing like a working model of one's current reality, this combines input from various senses and self-generated thoughts, images, etc. Consciousness selects some of this model. This is the spotlight.
Consciousness selects the model.
Yeah. So here, consciousness is causal. Yep. So the spotlight selects some of the model, and that's what we seem to be experiencing. This is then accessed, seen or heard in the metaphor by the audience and the backstage crew. The selective spotlight is a crucial part of this metaphor, so it's a bit confusing. I think that Baars sometimes calls this the conscious spotlight and at other times the spotlight of attention. I think, though I'm not sure, that he's trying to equate these notions, attention and consciousness, or at least explain consciousness in terms of attention. We can see this in how he talks about how different contents get into the spotlight. These follow a fairly standard pattern for how different kinds of attention are introduced in psychology. So let's have a look at each of these parts. We'll start with working memory. So Liz, what's working memory?
It has a capacity of 7 plus or minus 2.
Yeah.
Okay, I ask you to remember a phone number. Very old school. And You repeat it over and over to yourself. That repeating over and over to yourself is holding it in working memory. Or remembering a shopping list.
We're talking here about a short-term information store that functions to keep relevant information available. So why not just equate that whole thing with consciousness? If we're thinking of the example there of rehearsing a number over and over in our head, we're doing that consciously. So why not just equate working memory with consciousness?
Well, you might rehearse the number enough times that you then don't need to continue to rehearse it to remember.
That's what Baars is saying, that there is information that's maintained in working memory that isn't conscious. As Liz did, we used to do this with phone numbers, but no one memorizes phone numbers anymore, so we just do it with verification codes instead. So if you get 2 verification codes in a row, your task is to put in one and then the other. When you put in the second code, you need to stop consciously thinking about the first one. But if you are soon afterwards, you can still recall both codes for a little while. In this example, the first code is maintained in working memory, but is outside of consciousness. It's not an object of consciousness. Now, of course, such recall isn't perfect. People will make mistakes in that sort of task. But that it's possible at all is just what matters here. That there is a way to maintain in the short term task relevant information that isn't conscious. Next, I want to talk about attention. We've introduced one of the ways in which attention is talked about in the theatre metaphor, but it does appear in a couple of different parts of the theatre. The first that we've started talking about already is directed attention, which is sometimes called top-down attention. To our first approximation, which will do us for today, this is the kind of attention that it feels like you choose.
So when the teacher says, pay attention to this now, students.
In the verification code example, when you alternate thinking about the first code and the second one, on Baars' metaphor, that's you directing the spotlight of attention from one to the other. The other kind of attention that's relevant here is sometimes called bottom-up attention, although salience is the other term that gets used here. This is just a first approximation for the purposes of getting our heads around Baars' metaphor. Salience is the sense in which things get your attention.
Oh my gosh, that loud noise grabbed my attention.
Like that, we do it with vision a lot, so like a red fruit popping out on a mostly green plant would be a visual example. For Baars, the metaphor here is of different actors on the stage vying for the spotlight. He does say here that he's not super happy with this part of the metaphor, that salience is different actors on stage vying for the spotlight, because a lot of processing outside working memory, so this would be in the metaphor, the backstage stuff, is doing a lot of the work in salience. So that's just one limit of the metaphor and where the analogy starts to break down a little bit for Baars. Let's think a bit more about the metaphorical backstage, or processing outside of working memory. This plays a role in determining what makes it onto the stage of working memory and into the spotlight of attention or consciousness. Think here of the earlier example of the different meanings of the word set. Priming this, even unconsciously priming it with another word like put or tennis, influences which of the different meanings of the word set are selected, which one we are conscious of.
When we first recorded this, it was the Australian Open, and I'd been listening to my colleagues talk lots about tennis, and so I immediately thought game, set, match. So I was primed because of my colleagues' conversation.
In experiments, we do this by presenting a priming word, put or tennis, very quickly before a mask, such that subjects say they don't see another word there, but they then, when asked to define the word set, which definition they give is influenced by the priming word. So if they see tennis before they see the word set, they're more likely to say something like game, set, match if asked to use it in a sentence, whereas if they see put, they're more likely to say something like I set it down.
Because I'm primed to think sports. Every time you say put, I think shot put.
A major part of backstage processing in this metaphor is the director. This for Baars is analogous to what's called in psychology executive functioning. For example, whatever mechanism it turns out directs attention, metaphorically the spotlight here, is something which is not itself on the stage of working memory.
So is this directing top-down attention, pay attention, or grab attention?
Pay attention, yeah. The last part of the theatre metaphor, which for some theories of consciousness is going to be the most important, is the audience. These are other parts of the mind which consume or make use of the contents attended to under the spotlight on the working memory stage. To start with, we can speak of these in pretty general terms, but we're talking here of capacities like the capacity to produce meaningful speech, or motor control more generally, or form longer-term memories. How these things happen are not things that we experience consciously, but they are, on Baars' metaphor, processes that make use of what we are conscious of. So that's the theatre metaphor. As we had in one of the quotes I gave earlier, the theatre metaphor isn't the only one Baars uses. The other one is that of a gateway, specifically between the vast unconscious processes that's the backstage and the vast unconscious processing that is the audience. On both metaphors, which he runs together like that, in that sort of phrasing, where the gateway and the theatre get mixed. Consciousness is how one set of unconscious processes, like long-term memory and motor control, gain access to another set of unconscious processes, like perceptual processing. It's important, though, to note Baars' precise wording, because he says that consciousness creates this access, as opposed to others who we'll meet later in the series who argue that consciousness is that access. For Baars, consciousness is an intermediate causal step, specifically attention to something in working memory. This has some implications for understanding different cognitive processes like learning. He's thinking here about what is required to learn a technical discipline like computer programming or medicine. To get the knowledge we need to master those disciplines into long-term memory, for Baars, requires consciousness. That is how long-term memory gains access to the perceptually represented learning material. Quote, paying attention, becoming conscious of some material, seems to be the sovereign remedy for learning anything, applicable to many very different kinds of information. It is the universal solvent of the mind, end quote. This, he thinks, holds even for what we would call implicit learning.
Well, so can I give the example of how I screwed up some poor honours student's experiment?
You surely can.
So, like lots of psych undergrads, I had to participate in experiments to pass courses because honours students need subjects. And the thing I was doing was about implicit learning. And so the task was we were shown lots of times on analog clocks and we were told to remember them. And then we had to answer on a digital clock what the time was. And we were given tons, like far more than you could ever expect to be able to remember. And I had this feeling partway through. So I noticed that there were no times that were 3 o'clock because I like the number 3. And then I had this spreading awareness that the other times around 3 o'clock also weren't shown. And partway through my responding to the times in the digital format, I began to explicitly not respond with a time that was around 3. Turns out that all of the times had the hour only on the left-hand side of the clock. So between 6 and 12. And so partway through, I explicitly learned the implicit rule. And I remember it because the poor honest student was disappointed because they'd just spent an hour running me through the experiment and they had to exclude me because I had explicitly learnt what was meant to be implicit. And I'm sure that they found that lots of people who could not explicitly report the rules still had that inform their behaviour.
I just want to go to Baars' example because I'm not sufficiently familiar with that one. An example he gives is of learning that some words are nouns and some are verbs, and presumably that some are both. This is implicit in that we learn to distinguish nouns from verbs without labelling them as such. Indeed, children competently learn to use various nouns and verbs before they learn the words noun and verb. The acquired knowledge is implicit, but Baars contends that it still requires the conscious experience of spoken language to learn. In terms of his metaphor, the audience learns from what is in the spotlight, including at least sometimes what is implied by what is in the spotlight, not merely what is explicitly represented. Once something is in the spotlight of attention, its effects on other mental processes are automatic. An example he gives is of seeing a word and hearing it in inner speech. Perhaps a more neutral way of saying this is just pointing out how automatically words are comprehended. It's very hard, if not impossible, to see a word and not read it. However, that experience of reading appears to you. A lot of these processes are not ever represented, or at least not represented in great detail in consciousness themselves. So, typical example here, when asked, what's your mother's maiden name? We don't experience the process via which that answer is retrieved. The name seems to just pop into your mind as the answer. To use the metaphor, under the spotlight, the question appears, and then some short time later, the answer appears. But how the message gets from the audience to the backstage to put the answer up is outside of the spotlight. I'd like to pause and spend a moment on one set of audience members which I think are especially important. One intuition about or understanding of consciousness that we often have is that things in consciousness appear specifically to the subject. They appear to me. This is one reading of Nagel's notion of point of view, that it's my consciousness. And we'll see in coming weeks that this is a guiding assumption of things like the higher order thought theory of consciousness. On Baars' metaphor, why do things in the spotlight of my attention seem to be my experiences? For Baars, one of the audience members, or probably more accurate, a subset of them, is what he calls the narrative interpreter. This is a set of processes that weave what we experience into a narrative to make sense of current experience, what we're trying to do, and so on. We experience what is in consciousness as our own because when we're trying to understand what's going on, we tell a story in which the experiences are ours. For example, I can't reach that book without the ladder because the shelf I see is too high. I don't think Baars needs to be committed here to the claim that this is a necessary feature of consciousness. Though if we only focus on those experiences on which we reflect, it probably seems that way because the process of reflection weaves them into this narrative. Similarly, any experience which is actually reported is probably accessed by a narrative interpreter. On Baars' understanding, I think he's saying consciousness makes a perception accessible to these systems, but it doesn't guarantee that it is so accessed. So this needn't be one of the automatic audience members. The basis for Baars' proposal here is the experiences of split brain subjects. So, Liz, what's a split brain subject?
So, in order to stop epileptic seizures spreading throughout the brain, we would cut the connection between the two hemispheres of your cerebral cortex. And the result would be that for most people, language is primarily produced by structures on the left-hand side of their cerebral cortex. And so if you cut the connection between the left and the right-hand side of the brain, then what the person is able to talk about is primarily things that are processed on the left-hand side of their cortex.
For the patients who need this surgery, there can be some occasional conflict between what each hand was doing, and that led to some of the experimental work. So generally, people didn't report any impairments after this, but occasionally they'd get things like one hand buttoning up a shirt and another one unbuttoning it, or one hand reaching for weekend clothes and the other one reaching for work clothes. And this led to some experimental work just to try and understand what was going on there. If subjects who have had this surgery are presented with two different images to different visual hemifields, so different halves of the visual field, it's not to each eye like you do in binocular rivalry, just because of how the connections go, that some of the connections from each eye go to each hemisphere of the cortex. I do think that in one of the previous episodes where we were talking about this, we did accidentally say each eye at some point, but it's each visual hemifield. So if you're presented with two different images, say to the left hemisphere you see something covered in snow, and to the right visual hemisphere is a chicken foot, the subject who's had this surgery will say that they only saw the one presented to the right visual hemisphere, which is processed by the left hemisphere of the brain. So they will say chicken foot. As far as they're concerned, they only saw the chicken foot. They can't tell you at all about the one presented to the left visual hemifield. However, what's presented to the left visual field is still processed, and to quite a sophisticated degree. We know this because if we ask the subject to pick out an object associated with the image, they will pick out two different objects, one with each hand. In this case, if they're asked to respond with their right hand, they'll pick up a chicken. If they're asked to respond with their left hand, they would pick up a snow shovel. Now, when they pick up the snow shovel, they will then tell a story to try and make sense of why they picked that up. And they'll say something like, the shovel could be used to clean up after the chicken. They'll never acknowledge that they saw the snowy scene. On Baars' metaphor, some of the audience members, the systems that control movement of the left hand, have access to what's presented to the left visual hemifield, but those crucial ones that make up the narrative interpreter don't. So, Liz, what do you think, just sticking to Baars' metaphors, is the subject conscious of the snowy scene or not?
Well, you can't talk about it, but what these cases show is that talking about it might not always be the best measure of consciousness, because the reason they can't talk about it is because language tends to be on one side of the brain. And so the other side of the brain can't talk. But do we really want to say that the other side of the brain isn't conscious? I don't know.
Yeah, because if we took a subject who hadn't had this surgery and said, pick up the thing that goes with the image that you see, and just said, don't tell us the answer, we'd be happy to say that them picking up the snow shovel was an indication of their being conscious of the snowy scene.
We do that all the time in studies of visual consciousness.
There are other ways to read this as well. I think on Baars' metaphor, both scenes are getting into consciousness, but one of the audience members just doesn't have access to one of the things that is in consciousness. This is one of the places where I think the views that identify consciousness with access are a bit easier to get our heads around, because they would see this sort of scenario as cases of partial consciousness. The subject who's had the surgery would be conscious of the snowy scene in the sense that it can guide their reaching action, but they're not conscious in the sense that they can't talk about it. But we'll get to that as we get further through the series. So here is Baars' conclusion about these cases. Like I said, I don't think it's obvious that this is the one that we're forced into. So, quote, "The problem of subjectivity may demand a deeper understanding of how the observing self interacts with conscious contents. The self seems to monitor and control access to conscious events, maintaining continuity across different situations and in life circumstances. As described above, I seem to have access to perception, thought, memory, and body control. There is now a body of evidence that supports this common sense belief. Self and consciousness seem to be mutually necessary systems," end quote. This part could be read as saying it's not conscious at all if it's not accessible by the narrative interpreter systems. But it could also be read as saying that this is what's needed to explain appearance to a subject, and there could be another notion of consciousness as accessibility more general at play as well. So I don't know how satisfying all that is, but we have a couple of possible different reconceptualizations of consciousness here, as that which makes mental representation accessible to a bunch of processes that depend on the more specific notions of working memory and attention, or perhaps as what makes such mental representation accessible by narrative interpreter systems specifically. The latter would agree with Nagel that appearance to a subject is what consciousness is. The prior would see consciousness as potentially more piecemeal. That's enough of the theory light stuff. Like I said, Liz, I want to do a few episodes on mental representation and computation before we start going through specific theoretical proposals. With that, let's call it a day. Next time out will be a main series episode where we'll be talking about Sidney Carles Diamante's work on the disunity of consciousness. Thank you all. It was a particularly hideous spider, but as it turns out, not an especially dangerous one.
Sufficiently venomous to make Glenn feel horrible. For a while.
Yeah. But since then, much worse things have happened. Like we've seen a real spike in police violence in Australia. What a time to be alive, folks.
Keep safe.
Yeah, keep safe.
Keep fighting.
Keep fighting. Keep trying to make things better. Keep making things that bring joy and encourage us to ask questions of people and generally improve the amount of knowledge that we have.
And use your privilege if you're lucky to have some.